Sometimes love asks us to sacrifice everything, even the last precious memory we have left. When your loyal companion is starving and you've got nothing but the wedding ring your departed wife placed on your finger 40 years ago, what choice do you really have? This is the story of Boone McCready, a mountain man who came down from Pine Ridge one cold morning with his faithful dog by his side. 3 days without food had left them both desperate. At the estate of wealthy land Baron Elias Crane, Boone made an offer that would change both their lives forever. He held out that simple gold band and asked a question that cut straight to the heart. What happened next wasn't just about money or survival. It was about discovering what truly matters when everything else falls away. But would a rich man's heart prove softer than expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hand-carved wooden cross hung above the cabin door, weathered by 40 winters, but still bearing the delicate roses Sarah had requested. Boone McCready touched it every morning before stepping into the mountain air, a ritual as sacred as prayer itself. She'd made him promise to carve those roses, back when her hands were too weak to hold the knife, but her spirit remained strong as the pine trees surrounding their home. Make them beautiful. Boone, she'd whispered during those final weeks. So, when folks see them, they'll know love lived here. Rex lay sprawled on the porch, his golden coat dull in the early light. Once that dog had bounded through these hills like lightning, chasing rabbits and barking at the eagles that soared between the peaks. Now his ribs showed through his fur, and his breathing came in labored puffs that formed small clouds in the frigid air. 3 days without proper food had taken their toll on both man and beast. Boone knelt beside his companion, running weathered fingers through the dog's coat. Rex had been Sarah's final gift to him, a puppy she'd found wandering near the creek 2 months before she passed. "He'll keep you company," she'd said, cradling the tiny golden ball of fur against her chest. Dogs know how to love without asking for anything in return. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Here he was, asking Rex to survive on nothing while he struggled to find a solution to their predicament. Pine Ridge had always been unforgiving, but this winter felt different. The snows came early and stayed late, blocking the narrow road that connected his cabin to the valley below. His small pension from 30 years of logging barely covered the basics, and with the economy tightening its grip on rural communities, even those basics had become luxuries. The last of his savings had gone to heating oil 3 weeks ago. Boone stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold. At 68, he felt every winter more keenly than the last. His back ached from decades of felling trees, and his hands bore the scars of a life lived close to the earth. But his mind remained sharp, filled with memories of better times when the mountain provided enough and Sarah's laughter echoed through the pines. Their cabin sat on 5 acres of pristine wilderness, a piece of paradise that had belonged to Sarah's family for 3 generations. Her grandfather had built the original structure with logs cut from this very land, and each generation had added their own touches. Boone had expanded the kitchen when they married, dreaming of children who would fill those rooms with joy. The children never came, but their love had been enough to fill every corner of their small world. Now the silence felt overwhelming. He walked to the kitchen window and gazed down at the valley spread below. Ironwood Valley had once been home to family farms and small businesses, a community where neighbors helped neighbors, and everyone knew everyone else's story. But progress, as the newspapers called it, had come calling in the form of Elias Crane and his development company. Crane's mansion dominated the valley floor like a monument to ambition. 3 stories of imported stone and glass, surrounded by manicured gardens that required a team of groundskeepers to maintain. The locals whispered that he'd spent more on his wine cellar than most families saw in a lifetime. While mountain folk like Boone struggled to keep food on the table, Crane hosted elaborate dinner parties for investors and politicians. The man had a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. In 15 years of aggressive expansion, he'd acquired half the valley through a combination of shrewd negotiation and ruthless pressure. When the McGillicuddy farm fell behind on their mortgage, Crane appeared with a buyout offer that seemed generous until you read the fine print. When old Henrik Peterson's medical bills mounted after his heart attack, Crane swooped in with ready cash and sympathy that felt as genuine as fool's gold. Boone had watched it all from his mountain perch, grateful that Sarah's family land sat high enough to avoid Crane's immediate attention. But gratitude wouldn't feed Rex, and pride wouldn't pay for veterinary bills if his companion's condition worsened. The wedding ring sat heavy on his finger, a simple band of gold that Sarah had saved months to buy from the jewelry shop in Millfield. She'd worked extra shifts at the diner, walking the 15 miles each way because they couldn't afford gas for the old pickup truck. On their wedding day, she'd slipped it onto his finger with tears in her eyes and a smile that outshone the mountain sunshine. "Till death do us part," she'd whispered, but death hadn't parted them. Her presence filled every corner of this cabin, every memory carved into the walls like the roses on that wooden cross. The ring had never left his finger, not once in 43 years of marriage and 2 years of widowhood. Rex whimpered softly, drawing Boone's attention back to the present crisis. The dog tried to lift his head, but lacked the strength, settling instead for a gentle thump of his tail against the porch boards. That tail had once been a weapon of mass destruction, capable of clearing coffee tables and knocking small children off their feet. Now it barely had the energy to express gratitude for a gentle touch. Boone's throat tightened as he remembered the last conversation with Dr. Patterson in town. The veterinarian had been blunt about Rex's declining health, mentioning tests and treatments that might help if caught early enough. The cost had made Boone's head spin, more money than he saw in 6 months. Maybe more than he'd see in a year with prices rising the way they were. "I know it's hard to hear," Dr. Patterson had said, his kind eyes reflecting genuine concern. "But Rex is still young enough to recover if we act quickly. Dogs are resilient creatures, Mr. McCready. With proper nutrition and medical care, he could have several good years ahead of him." Several good years. The phrase echoed in Boone's mind as he watched his companion struggle with each breath. Rex was only 7 years old, barely middle-aged for a dog his size. He deserved those years. Deserved to chase rabbits through the pine forest and swim in the creek when summer finally returned to the mountains. But deserving something and being able to provide, it were two different matters entirely. Boone pulled his worn coat tighter against the morning chill and made his way to the small shed where he kept his tools. Sarah's garden tools hung neatly on hooks she'd installed herself, each one clean and ready for spring planting that might never come. Her flower seeds sat in labeled jars on a wooden shelf, saved from last year's blooms with the eternal optimism of someone who believed in tomorrow. He'd been putting off this decision for days, hoping some miracle would present itself. Maybe a delayed pension check would arrive, or perhaps one of the neighbors would need some winter work done. But deep down he knew the truth. Pine Ridge was barely hanging on, its residents too busy surviving to hire help they couldn't afford. The ring caught the early light as he lifted his hand to touch Sarah's garden gloves, still hanging where she'd left them. The gold had worn thin in places, polished smooth by decades of honest work and constant wear. It wasn't worth much to anyone else, a simple band without diamonds or elaborate engravings. But to Boone, it represented everything he'd ever loved or lost. "What would you do, Sarah?" he whispered to the empty shed. "How do I choose between honoring your memory and saving Rex's life?" The wind through the pine boughs seemed to carry her voice, gentle as always, practical as the mountain folk who'd raised her. She'd loved that dog from the moment she'd found him, wet and shivering by the creek. She'd also loved Boone enough to slip that ring onto his finger and promise forever. But Sarah had always been clear about her priorities. Love wasn't about symbols or possessions, it was about action. It was about doing whatever needed to be done to protect the ones you cherished, even when the cost felt unbearable. Rex's labored breathing drifted from the porch, a reminder that time was running short. In the valley below, smoke rose from Crane's massive fireplace, a sign that the man was home and available for the conversation that could change everything. Boone closed the shed door and walked back to the cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. Rex managed to lift his head as Boone approached, brown eyes still bright with the intelligence and loyalty that had made him such a perfect companion. Those eyes held no judgment, no expectation beyond the simple hope that somehow things would work out. "I know, boy," Boone said softly, kneeling to scratch behind Rex's ears. "I know it hurts and I know you're tired, but I'm going to fix this, I promise." The promise hung in the morning air like frost, beautiful and fragile, and destined to melt away unless decisive action preserved it. Boone looked down at the ring one more time, then at his faithful companion, then at the valley where answers waited behind the walls of a mansion he'd never thought to approach. Love required sacrifice. Sometimes it required swallowing pride that had been years in the building. And sometimes it required trusting that the right thing would somehow be enough, even when you couldn't see how the pieces would fit together. The hand-carved cross above the door caught his eye one final time as he prepared to leave the mountain. Sarah's roses seemed to nod in the breeze, beautiful and enduring, a reminder that love could survive even the harshest winters if you were willing to tend it properly. Rex would need that kind of tending now. And if selling a ring could provide it, then perhaps some sacrifices were blessings in disguise. The collapse happened so suddenly that Boone almost missed it. One moment Rex was attempting to follow him to the woodshed, tail wagging weakly, but still maintaining that determined spirit that had carried him through 7 years of mountain life. The next moment, his legs simply gave out, and he crumpled to the frozen ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut. "Rex!" Boone dropped the armload of kindling and rushed to his companion's side. The dog's breathing had become shallow and rapid, his tongue lolling from his mouth in a way that spoke of serious distress. When Boone placed his hand on Rex's chest, he could feel the irregular hammering of a heart working too hard to sustain a body that was slowly shutting down. Rex's brown eyes found Boone's face, and in them was an expression the old mountain man had seen before, during Sarah's final weeks, when her body had begun the process of letting go while her spirit still burned bright. It was the look of someone who understood that time was running short, but trusted completely in the love that surrounded them. "Not yet, boy," Boone whispered, gathering the golden retriever into his arms. Rex felt lighter than he should have, his once solid frame reduced to bones and matted fur. "We're not giving up yet." The drive down the mountain had never felt longer. Boone's old pickup truck protested every turn and bump, its engine struggling with the steep descent as much as its owner struggled with the weight of impending loss. Rex lay across his lap, occasionally lifting his head to look out the window at the pine forests rushing past, as if trying to memorize the landscape he might never see again. Dr. James Patterson had been treating animals in Ironwood Valley for 35 years, long enough to recognize desperation when it walked through his door. He was a tall, lean man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering to offer false hope, but enough genuine care to make even the hardest truths bearable. "How long has he been like this?" Dr. Patterson asked, his hands moving expertly over Rex's prone form on the examination table. The leather-bound medical journal where he recorded his findings lay open beside them, its pages filled with neat handwriting that documented the health histories of every animal in the valley. "The collapse just happened this morning," Boone replied, one hand resting protectively on Rex's head. "But he's been getting weaker for days. Not eating much, sleeping more than usual." Dr. Patterson nodded, his stethoscope moving across Rex's chest and abdomen as he listened to the sounds that would tell the story Boone feared to hear. The veterinarian's expression grew more serious with each passing moment, and when he finally looked up, his eyes held the kind of compassion that comes before difficult news. "Mr. McCready, I need to be honest with you," Dr. Patterson said, making notes in his journal with careful precision. Rex is suffering from severe malnutrition and dehydration, but that's not the worst of it. His heart is showing signs of stress that suggest this has been building for weeks, maybe longer. His liver function is compromised, and I'm seeing early signs of kidney dysfunction. Boone felt the words hit him like physical blows. What does that mean? It means we're looking at a cascade of organ stress brought on by prolonged starvation. In a dog Rex's age and size, this can be reversed, but only with immediate and intensive intervention. Dr. Patterson closed the journal and leaned against the examination table. We're talking about IV fluids, cardiac monitoring, specialized nutrition therapy, and probably a week of hospitalization while we stabilize his condition. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of Rex's labored breathing and the distant barking of other dogs in the boarding kennels. Boone knew what came next. The conversation about money that would determine whether love was enough to save a life. "Doc, I need to ask you straight out," Boone said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "What's something like that going to cost?" Dr. Patterson consulted his notes, and Boone could see him calculating not just medical expenses, but the human cost of honesty. With everything Rex needs, the diagnostics, the treatment, the monitoring, you're looking at somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000. Maybe more if complications arise. The number hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million for a man living on a fixed income in a cabin without heat. Boone's entire monthly pension was less than $400, and most of that went to basic survival. "I see," Boone said quietly, though he was seeing far more than numbers. He was seeing the end of hope, the final chapter of a story that had already lost too many characters he loved. "Mr. McCready," Dr. Patterson said gently, "I've known you and Sarah for years. I know this isn't easy, and I want you to know that we'll work with you however we can. Payment plans, reduce costs for medications, whatever it takes to help Rex." Boone appreciated the kindness, but they both knew that spreading $4,000 over time didn't change the fundamental problem. He simply didn't have that kind of money, no matter how it was divided. "How long does he have?" Boone asked, the words scraping his throat raw. "Without treatment. Maybe a few days, possibly a week if we can get some fluids into him and he responds well to basic supportive care." Dr. Patterson's hand moved to Rex's head, scratching gently behind his ears. With treatment, he could have years ahead of him. Dogs are remarkably resilient when they get proper care. Years. The word echoed in Boone's mind as he looked down at his companion. Rex had rallied slightly since arriving at the clinic, perhaps responding to the warmth and the attention, or maybe just grateful to be anywhere other than the cold mountain cabin. His tail managed a weak wag when Boone spoke his name. "Can you give him something for today?" Boone asked. "Some fluids, maybe some nutrients to buy us a little time?" "Of course," Dr. Patterson said immediately. "We'll start an IV right now, get him hydrated, and give him some glucose to help with his energy levels. That should help him feel better for the next day or two." As the veterinarian prepared the IV setup, Boone found himself thinking about the drive down the mountain, about the moment when Rex had lifted his head to look out at the pine forests. There had been something in that gesture, not resignation, but a kind of peaceful acceptance that spoke to the deep bond between them. Rex trusted him. After 7 years of shared meals, shared walks through the forest, shared quiet evenings by the fire, the dog trusted that Boone would make the right decision, whatever that might be. It was the same trust Sarah had shown during her final illness. The absolute faith that love would find a way, even when the way seemed impossible to see. The IV needle slipped into Rex's leg with practiced ease, and almost immediately Boone could see a subtle change in his companion's demeanor. The dog's breathing became less labored, his eyes brighter, as life-giving fluids began to do their work. "That should help for now," Dr. Patterson said, adjusting the flow rate on the IV bag. "But Mr. McCready, I need you to understand this is just buying time. Without the full treatment protocol, we're only postponing the inevitable." Boone nodded, understanding perfectly. He also understood something else that Dr. Patterson couldn't know. Sometimes buying time was exactly what you needed to find the courage for an impossible choice. "Doc, can I ask you something?" Boone said as they watched Rex's breathing gradually ease. "If someone brought you $4,000 tomorrow, cash in hand, could you save him?" "Absolutely," Dr. Patterson replied without hesitation. "Rex is young and strong underneath all this. With proper treatment, he could make a full recovery and live a normal, healthy life." Boone absorbed this information, feeling it settle into his chest next to the weight of the wedding ring that never left his finger. Rex could be saved. The means existed, the expertise was available. The only missing piece was money, and money was just another form of exchange. As Rex rested more peacefully under the influence of the IV fluids, Boone made his decision. Some things were worth more than gold, but sometimes gold was exactly what you needed to protect the things that mattered most. The leather-bound journal lay open on the counter, documenting the crisis that had brought them here. Soon, it might also document the miracle that saved Rex's life, if Boone could find the strength to do what Sarah would have done without hesitation. Love required action, not sentiment. And tomorrow, action would take the form of a conversation with a man who had everything and might just possibly understand what it meant to have nothing left to lose. The iron gates of the Crane estate loomed before Boone, like the entrance to another world. Wrought iron twisted into elaborate patterns that spoke of European craftsmanship and unlimited budgets. Each scroll and flourish, declaring that whoever lived beyond these barriers existed on a plane far removed from mountain cabins and struggling pensioners. Boone sat in his truck for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, gathering the courage that seemed to leak away with each passing second. Through the ornate metalwork, he could see the circular driveway that led to Crane's mansion, its pristine asphalt unmarked by the mud and gravel that characterized mountain roads. Even the snow here seemed cleaner somehow, as if winter itself had been negotiated into a more manageable form. The silver-framed photograph of Sarah rested on his dashboard, a picture taken during their 20th wedding anniversary when they'd splurged on dinner at the hotel in Millfield. Her smile radiated the same warmth that had sustained him through 4 decades of marriage, and her eyes held the gentle wisdom that had guided every important decision they'd made together. "Give me strength, darling," he whispered to her image. "Help me find the right words." Rex lay sleeping in the passenger seat, the IV fluids from Dr. Patterson's clinic having provided enough relief to allow for peaceful rest. The dog's breathing had steadied, and some color had returned to his gums, but Boone knew this improvement was temporary. They had perhaps 2 days before the crisis returned, 2 days to secure the miracle that would save his companion's life. The intercom beside the gate crackled to life before Boone could even approach it. "State your business," came a voice that sounded like it had been trained to discourage visitors rather than welcome them. "Boone McCready to see Mr. Crane," he replied, his voice carrying across the distance between his truck and the speaker. "It's about a business proposition." A long pause followed, during which Boone imagined conversations taking place in rooms he'd never seen, discussions about whether a mountain man in a 20-year-old pickup truck warranted their employer's attention. The silence stretched long enough that he began to wonder if they'd simply decided to ignore him. Then the gates began to swing open with the smooth precision of expensive machinery. The driveway curved through landscaped grounds that must have required an army of gardeners to maintain. Even in winter's grip, the property managed to convey wealth and control. Evergreen shrubs stood in perfect formation, their branches heavy with snow that looked like it had been arranged by an artist. Stone sculptures emerged from careful plantings, abstract forms that probably cost more than most people's homes. Boone parked his truck in front of the main entrance, feeling suddenly conscious of the rust spots along the wheel wells and the duct tape that held the passenger side mirror in place. His vehicle looked like exactly what it was, the transport of a working man who maintained his possessions with pride but couldn't afford to replace them when they showed their age. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her 50s, whose severe expression matched her steel-gray hair and expensive suit. Everything about her suggested efficiency and the kind of professional distance that kept unwanted complications at arm's length. "Mr. McCready," she said, consulting a tablet in her hands. "I'm Mrs. Harrison, Mr. Crane's personal assistant. He can spare you 10 minutes, 10 minutes to save Rex's life." Boone nodded his understanding and followed her into a foyer that could have housed his entire cabin. Marble floors reflected light from a crystal chandelier that hung like a frozen waterfall above their heads. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, depicting landscapes that looked suspiciously like idealized versions of the very mountains where Boone struggled to survive. "Wait here," Mrs. Harrison instructed, gesturing toward a chair that probably cost more than Boone's monthly pension. "Mr. Crane will be with you shortly." She disappeared through a doorway that led deeper into the mansion, leaving Boone alone with his thoughts and the overwhelming evidence of wealth that surrounded him. Every surface spoke of money casually spent, from the imported marble beneath his feet to the Persian rugs that defined seating areas within the vast space. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he sat, surrounded by luxury that could fund dozens of veterinary treatments, preparing to beg for help from a man who probably spent more on wine than most families spent on food. The gap between their worlds felt insurmountable. A chasm measured not just in dollars, but in fundamental understanding of what constituted necessity versus comfort. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, measured and confident, the sound of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room they entered. Elias Crane appeared with the kind of presence that commanded attention without requiring effort. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair perfectly styled and clothing that suggested regular consultations with expensive tailors. "Mr. McCready," Crane said, extending a hand that felt soft against Boone's work-roughened palm. "I understand you have a business proposition for me." "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Crane," Boone replied, grateful that his voice remained steady despite the nervousness that threatened to betray him. "I know your time is valuable." "Indeed it is," Crane agreed, settling into a chair that faced Boone across a coffee table that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of exotic wood. "So let's get straight to the point. What brings a mountain man to my door?" The bluntness of the question caught Boone off guard, though perhaps he should have expected such directness from a man known for his ruthless business practices. There would be no small talk here, no gentle approach to the subject that had driven him down from Pine Ridge. "My dog is dying," Boone said simply, deciding that honesty would serve him better than elaborate explanations. "The vet says he can be saved, but the treatment costs more money than I have." Crane's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but perhaps a spark of interest in the novelty of such a straightforward request. "And you've come to me because?" "Because I have something to sell that might interest you," Boone replied, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw the small velvet box that had contained Sarah's engagement ring decades ago. The wedding band lay nestled in faded purple fabric, its simple gold surface catching the light from the crystal chandelier. Crane leaned forward slightly, his gaze moving from the ring to Boone's face and back again. "A wedding ring." "My wife's ring," Boone corrected gently. 43 years of marriage never left my finger since the day she put it there, and now you want to sell it to save a dog." The way Crane said it made the transaction sound either noble or foolish, depending on one's perspective. Boone couldn't tell which interpretation the wealthy man favored, but he pressed forward regardless. "Rex isn't just a dog, Mr. Crane. He was my wife's final gift to me, her way of making sure I wouldn't be alone after she passed. For 2 years, he's been my only companion, my only family." Boone paused, searching for words that might bridge the gap between their different worlds. "I know it might not make sense to someone who has everything, but that dog represents the last living connection I have to the woman I loved." Crane picked up the ring, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who understood the value of precious metals and gemstones. The band looked even smaller in his manicured hands, a simple circle of gold that spoke of modest means and enduring commitment rather than flashy displays of wealth. "It's not worth much," Crane said finally, setting the ring back in its velvet box with careful precision. "Maybe $300, perhaps $400 if you found the right buyer who appreciated the sentiment." The words hit Boone like cold mountain air, sharp and breathtaking in their finality. $400 wouldn't even cover the initial diagnostic tests Dr. Patterson had mentioned, let alone the thousands needed for Rex's full treatment. He'd known the ring wasn't valuable in monetary terms, but hearing it confirmed so casually made his heart sink toward his boots. "I see," Boone managed, though he wasn't sure he saw anything clearly anymore. The mansion around him seemed to grow larger and more oppressive, each expensive detail a reminder of how little his most precious possession meant in a world measured by market value. Crane leaned back in his chair, studying Boone with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating opportunities and finding them wanting. "However," he continued after a moment that felt like an eternity, "I'm curious about something. You said your wife passed 2 years ago?" "Yes, sir. Cancer took her, slow and hard. And this property of yours on Pine Ridge, how many acres?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Boone felt a familiar wariness creep up his spine. Sarah's family land had been the subject of subtle inquiries before, usually from real estate agents working for companies whose names he didn't recognize, but whose intentions were clear enough. 5 acres, Boone replied carefully. "They've been in Sarah's family for 3 generations. Beautiful location," Crane mused, his fingers steepled as he gazed out the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the valley below. "I imagine the views are spectacular, especially in autumn when the leaves turn." "They are," Boone agreed, unsure where this conversation was heading, but sensing undercurrents that made him uncomfortable. Crane rose from his chair and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that suggested deep contemplation. "You know, Mr. McCready, I've been in the development business for a long time. I understand the value of strategic properties, especially those with elevation and privacy. Your land, positioned as it is above the valley, would be quite valuable to the right buyer." The penny dropped with the weight of a falling tree. This wasn't about charity or compassion for a dying dog. This was about business, about opportunity, about turning human desperation into profitable acquisition. Boone felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the familiar pattern that had claimed so many of his neighbors over the years. "My land isn't for sale." "Mr. Crane, everything is for sale at the right price," Crane replied without turning around. "The question is whether we can arrive at a figure that solves your immediate problem while providing fair compensation for a truly unique property." Boone stood slowly, the wedding ring box clutched in his weathered hand like a talisman against the forces gathering around him. "That land is my home. It's where I built my life with Sarah, where her ashes are scattered among the pine trees she loved. It's not just property, it's sacred ground." Crane turned then, his expression showing neither surprise nor disappointment at Boone's response. If anything, he looked pleased, as if this resistance was exactly what he'd expected, and perhaps even hoped for. "Sacred ground doesn't pay veterinary bills," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "And sentiment, however admirable, won't save your dog's life." The truth of those words cut deeper than Boone wanted to admit. He could stand on principle, could protect Sarah's heritage and maintain his connection to the land that held their shared memories. But principles wouldn't fund Rex's treatment, and memories wouldn't keep his faithful companion alive through another week of deteriorating health. "What are you offering?" Boone heard himself ask, though the words felt like betrayal even as they left his mouth. $200,000. Crane replied without hesitation, the figure rolling off his tongue with the ease of someone who'd calculated it long before this conversation began. "Cash, no financing contingencies, closing within 30 days. The amount was staggering, more money than Boone had ever imagined possessing. It represented financial security for the rest of his life, enough to pay for Rex's treatment and still have resources for any future emergencies. It was also, he suspected, far less than the land was actually worth to someone with Crane's development plans. "That's generous," Boone said carefully. "But like I said, the land isn't for sale." "Think about it," Crane suggested, his tone remaining conversational despite the enormity of what he was proposing. "You could save your dog, secure your own future, and move somewhere more suitable for a man of your age. Perhaps a nice cottage in town, closer to medical facilities and social services." The casual dismissal of everything Boone held dear, his independence, his connection to the mountains, his right to age in place on land that belonged to his family, sparked a flame of anger in his chest. This was how it always worked with men like Crane. They identified your weakness, applied pressure at exactly the right point, and made their exploitation sound like salvation. "Mr. Crane," Boone said, rising to his feet with dignity that came from decades of honest work and principled living, "I appreciate your time, but I think we're done here, are we?" Crane asked, his voice carrying just enough challenge to make it clear that he wasn't accustomed to being dismissed by mountain men in need. "Because your dog will be dead in a week, and you'll still be sitting on that mountain with nothing but memories and regret." The words were designed to hurt, and they succeeded. Boone felt them pierce through his resolve like arrows finding their mark. Rex was dying, time was running out, and pride, however justified, wouldn't change the brutal mathematics of the situation. "You're a hard man, Mr. Crane." "I'm a realistic man," Crane corrected. "Sentiment is a luxury that people in your position can't afford. I'm offering you a solution to an impossible problem. The question is whether you're wise enough to accept it." Boone tucked the ring box back into his jacket pocket, feeling the weight of Sarah's wedding band against his chest, like a physical reminder of the promises he'd made and the choices that lay before him. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, dusting the perfectly manicured landscape with a covering that would soon turn dirty and inconvenient. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course," Crane agreed, walking him toward the foyer with the measured pace of someone who understood that rushed decisions rarely favored the desperate party in any negotiation. "But don't think too long, Mr. McCready. Time isn't something your dog has in abundance." As Boone stepped back into the cold mountain air, he felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like snow that would never melt. The old wooden rocking chair creaked with familiar rhythm as Boone sat on his porch, watching Rex sleep in the pale afternoon sunlight. The IV fluids had bought them precious time, but even a mountain man could see that his companion's condition remained precarious. Every breath still required effort, and the brief moments of alertness were followed by longer periods of exhausted rest. Sarah's quilt lay draped across Boone's lap, its hand-stitched patterns telling the story of their life together through fabric and thread. She'd worked on it during the long winter evenings, her fingers dancing across the material even when arthritis made the work painful. Each square represented a memory: their wedding day, their first Christmas in the cabin, the trips they'd taken to visit her sister in Colorado. "What would you do, darling?" Boone whispered to the mountain air, his fingers tracing the careful stitches that formed a pine tree in the quilt's center panel. "How do I choose between saving Rex and keeping your family's land?" The wind through the pine boughs carried no answers, only the familiar sounds of a wilderness that had sheltered and sustained them for decades. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried as it rode the thermal currents above the valley, free from the weight of impossible decisions that bound earthbound creatures to their choices. Boone's mind kept returning to Crane's words, each syllable as sharp and cutting as winter wind. $200,000 would solve every problem he faced: Rex's treatment, his own uncertain future, the mounting pressures of maintaining property he could barely afford to heat. It was more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes of pension checks, but it was also surrender. He rose from the rocking chair and walked to the edge of his property, where the land dropped away toward the valley below. From this vantage point, he could see the entire sweep of Ironwood Valley, from Crane's mansion gleaming like a jewel, among manicured gardens to the small farms and modest homes that dotted the landscape between the mountains and the main highway. Most of those properties had once belonged to families like his own, people whose roots ran deep in mountain soil, whose names appeared on gravestones in the Valley Cemetery dating back to the 1800s. One by one, economic pressure and medical emergencies had forced them to sell to developers who promised to preserve the rural character of the area while systematically transforming it into something entirely different. The McGillicuddy farm had become a gated community called Pine Vista Estates. Old Henrik Peterson's ranch now hosted a luxury spa that catered to wealthy tourists seeking authentic mountain experiences in climate-controlled comfort. The Yamamoto family's organic vegetable operation had been replaced by a golf course that required more water in a single day than the original farm had, used in an entire season. Each transformation had been presented as progress, as economic development that would benefit the entire community. The reality was starker, a systematic replacement of working families with weekend retreats, for people who could afford to buy authenticity rather than live it. Boone understood now why Crane had been so quick to dismiss the wedding ring and pivot to discussing real estate. The ring was incidental, a pretext that provided an opportunity to assess the man who owned one of the last undeveloped parcels in the valley. The conversation had never been about charity or compassion. It had been a business negotiation disguised as humanitarian aid. Rex stirred on the porch, lifting his head to watch a squirrel scamper across the yard with the kind of lazy interest that suggested the IV fluids were still providing some relief. For a moment, the dog looked almost like his old self, alert and engaged with the world around him. Then the effort proved too much, and he settled back onto the blanket with a soft sigh that spoke of profound weariness. The sight of his companion's struggle renewed Boone's sense of urgency. Dr. Patterson had been clear about the timeline. Without proper treatment, Rex had days rather than weeks. The IV fluids were a temporary measure, a small dam holding back an inevitable flood. Every hour that passed without decisive action brought them closer to a moment when no amount of money or medical intervention would be enough. Boone walked back to the cabin and retrieved the photograph of Sarah from his truck's dashboard. Her smile seemed to follow him as he carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals and conversations. Even in the simple frame, her presence filled the room with warmth that no amount of expensive heating could match. "You always said that home isn't a place. It's the people you love," he said to her image. "But what happens when the people are gone, and all you have left is the place?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the wood stove, complex and impossible to resolve with simple logic. Sarah had indeed believed that love mattered more than location, that family was created through commitment rather than geography. But she'd also loved this mountain, had found peace in its rhythms and strength in its enduring presence. The telephone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the afternoon quiet like a blade. Boone considered letting it ring. Few people called the mountain, and most of the conversations that found their way to his cabin brought complications rather than comfort. But something made him pick up the receiver on the fourth ring. Mr. McCready. The voice belonged to Dr. Patterson, and its careful tone suggested news that wouldn't improve his day. "I wanted to check on Rex and see how he's responding to the fluids." "Better for now," Boone replied honestly. "More alert, breathing easier. But I can tell it's not going to last." "That's what I was afraid of," Dr. Patterson said. "The improvement from IV fluids is usually temporary in cases like this. I'd estimate you have maybe 48 hours before we're back where we started, possibly worse. 48 hours. 2 days to find $4,000, or watch his faithful companion slip away, despite everything medical science could offer." The timeline felt both impossibly short and cruelly long. Too brief to find a miracle, too extended to endure the weight of watching Rex decline. "Doc, I need to ask you something," Boone said, settling into the kitchen chair where Sarah used to sit for their morning coffee. "If I could somehow get the money together, how quickly could you start the treatment?" "Immediately," Dr. Patterson replied without hesitation. "I've already run the initial blood work, so we just need to get Rex back here and begin the protocol. The sooner we start, the better his chances of full recovery. The words carried more hope than Boone had felt since Rex's collapse that morning. His companion could live, could return to chasing squirrels and swimming in the creek, could provide years more of loyal companionship. All it required was a decision that felt like cutting out his own heart. "Thank you. Doc, I'll be in touch." Boone hung up the phone and sat in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the accumulated memories of a lifetime spent in harmony with the mountain. Every piece of furniture, every tool in the shed, every carefully tended detail of their small paradise spoke of love made manifest through daily choices and shared commitment. But love also meant action when action was required, even when that action demanded sacrifices that felt unbearable. Rex deserved to live, and Boone had the power to make that possible. The question was whether he possessed the courage to pay the price that salvation demanded. The old cedar chest at the foot of their bed had remained untouched since Sarah's passing, its brass hinges tarnished but still functional after decades of faithful service. Boone had avoided opening it, knowing that the contents would unleash a flood of memories he wasn't sure he was strong enough to navigate. But tonight, with Rex sleeping fitfully on the rug beside him and 48 hours ticking away like a countdown to heartbreak, he felt drawn to the repository of their shared history. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that still carried the faint scent of Sarah's lavender sachets, lay the accumulated treasures of their marriage. The yellowed newspaper clipping from their wedding announcement, her grandmother's pearl earrings, saved for special occasions that never seemed quite special enough. The baby shoes they'd bought during that bright month when they'd thought Sarah was pregnant. Before the doctor's gentle explanation dashed their hopes for children, at the bottom of the chest, beneath layers of carefully preserved mementos, Boone found what he was looking for, the worn leather journal, where Sarah had recorded her thoughts during those final weeks of her illness. Her handwriting grew progressively weaker as the pages progressed, but her words remained clear and purposeful, filled with the wisdom that had guided their decisions throughout their marriage. He opened to a page near the end, where her observations about life and love had taken on the crystalline clarity that sometimes comes when time grows short. "Today, Boone asked me what I want him to remember about us." She had written in pencil that had faded but remained legible. "I told him to remember that love isn't about keeping things. It's about letting them go when letting go serves love better than holding on. We never had children, but we had each other. And we had this mountain, and we had the gift of building something beautiful together. If the day comes when he has to choose between honoring my memory and protecting something we both loved, I hope he chooses love. I hope he remembers that the best way to honor the dead is to serve the living." Boone's throat tightened as he read the words again, hearing Sarah's voice in each carefully chosen phrase. Even in her pain, even facing the prospect of leaving everything she cherished, she'd been thinking about his future, about the decisions he might face when she was no longer there to help him navigate them. Rex whimpered in his sleep, legs twitching as he chased dream rabbits through forests that existed only in his increasingly fragile mind. The sound brought Boone back to the present crisis, to the choice that had to be made before morning brought another day of watching his companion slip away. The leather journal felt warm in his hands as he carried it to the kitchen table, setting it beside the photograph of Sarah, where the lamplight could illuminate both her smile and her words. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, each flake catching the light from the cabin windows like tiny stars against the darkness. Boone reached for the telephone and dialed the number that Mrs. Harrison had given him, the direct line to Crane's private office. It rang twice before the familiar voice answered, sounding alert despite the late hour. "Mr. Crane?" It's Boone McCready. Ah, Mr. McCready, I wondered when I might hear from you again. Crane's tone carried no surprise, as if he'd been expecting this call, and had perhaps even calculated when desperation would overcome pride. I trust you've had time to consider our conversation. I have, Boone replied, his voice steadier than he felt. But I want to make sure I understand what you're offering. 200,000 for my 5 acres, cash, closing within 30 days. That's correct. Though I should mention that my offer has an expiration date. Real estate opportunities don't wait indefinitely, even in our current market. The implied pressure was subtle, but unmistakable. Crane understood the power dynamics at play. Boone needed money immediately, while the developer could afford to wait for more favorable terms or pursue alternative properties. Every hour that passed strengthened Crane's negotiating position while weakening Boone's. When does your offer expire? Boone asked. Tomorrow at noon, Crane replied smoothly. After that, I'll need to explore other options for expanding my holdings in the valley. 12 hours. The timeline had just contracted from barely manageable to nearly impossible. Boone felt the walls of his situation closing in, each option disappearing like paths blocked by avalanche until only one route remained open. Mr. Crane, I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Boone's fingers traced the edge of Sarah's journal as he spoke. What do you plan to do with my land? A pause followed, long enough for Boone to hear the grandfather clock in Crane's study, marking the passage of seconds that felt like minutes. When Crane finally spoke, his tone had shifted from negotiation to something approaching respect. I plan to develop it into a luxury retreat for executives who want to experience authentic mountain living without sacrificing modern conveniences. Helicopter access, climate-controlled cabins, private hiking trails with guided wilderness experiences. Crane's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone describing a personal vision. It will be tasteful, environmentally sensitive, and quite profitable. Boone closed his eyes, imagining helicopters landing where eagles once soared, seeing climate-controlled cabins where his own simple shelter had weathered 43 winters through the honesty of wood heat and wool blankets. The transformation would be complete and irreversible, erasing not just his home, but the entire character of the ridge that had sheltered his family for 3 generations. And my cabin would need to be removed, of course. The structure doesn't meet current building codes, and the aesthetic doesn't align with the luxury market we're targeting. Crane paused, perhaps recognizing the brutality of his words. Though I'd be happy to help you relocate it to a more suitable location, if that has sentimental value. The offer felt like being told he could keep Sarah's wedding dress, but would need to burn down the church where they'd been married. Some things couldn't be moved without losing everything that made them meaningful. Rex stirred on his blanket, opening eyes that held the patient trust of a creature who believed completely in the wisdom and love of his human companion. In those brown depths, Boone saw the same faith that Sarah had shown during her final illness, absolute confidence that whatever decision was made would come from love and be guided by the best intentions. Even when the outcome remained uncertain, Mr. McCready. Crane's voice carried across the phone line. Are you still there? I'm here, Boone replied, though he felt suspended between worlds, caught between the weight of the past and the demands of the present. I know this is difficult, Crane said, and for the first time his tone carried something that might have been genuine sympathy. But sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let go of what we can't preserve in order to save what we can. The words echoed Sarah's journal entry with uncomfortable accuracy. Crane might be a ruthless businessman, but he understood something fundamental about the nature of sacrifice and the mathematics of love. Sometimes holding on became a form of selfishness, a way of preserving personal comfort at the expense of greater good. I need the night to think, Boone said finally. Of course, but remember, tomorrow at noon the offer expires. After that, you'll be facing this crisis without any viable solution. The line went dead, leaving Boone alone with the ticking of the mantel clock and the sound of Rex's labored breathing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the familiar landscape with a blanket of white that made everything look different, transformed, as if the mountain itself was preparing for the changes that morning would bring. Dawn came grey and cold, the kind of morning that made the world feel smaller and possibilities more limited. Boone had spent the night in the rocking chair beside Rex, dozing fitfully while his mind wrestled with the decision that would define the remainder of his life. The dog had rallied slightly in the early hours before sunrise, even managing to drink a little water and wag his tail when Boone spoke his name. But the improvement was temporary, and they both knew it. At 8:30, the telephone rang with news that changed everything. Mr. McCready. "This is Janet Kowalski from the county assessor's office." The woman's voice carried an official tone that immediately put Boone on guard. "I'm calling about the property assessment we completed on your Pine Ridge parcels last month." Boone frowned, trying to remember any official visit or documentation that might have prompted such a call. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't recall any assessment being done." "Oh, it was a drive-by evaluation for tax purposes," she explained quickly. "We've been updating assessments throughout the valley to reflect current market values. I'm calling because there's been an error in our initial calculation that we need to correct." "What kind of error?" Papers rustled on the other end of the line as Janet consulted her records. "It appears we significantly undervalued your property in our preliminary assessment. Your 5 acres, given their elevation, privacy, and development potential, are actually worth considerably more than we initially calculated." Boone's grip tightened on the phone receiver. "How much more?" "Based on recent comparable sales and the unique characteristics of your land, we're looking at a fair market value of approximately $450,000. Perhaps more, depending on access rights and utilities availability." The number hit Boone like lightning striking the mountain ridge. $450,000, more than double what Crane had offered, and enough to save Rex while providing security for the rest of his life. More importantly, it revealed that Crane's generous offer had been calculated to exploit his desperation rather than provide fair compensation. "Ma'am, are you certain about that figure?" "Absolutely. In fact, I'm required to inform you that you have the right to request an independent appraisal if you disagree with our assessment. Given the potential tax implications, many property owners in your situation choose to have a certified appraiser provide a detailed evaluation." Boone thanked Janet and hung up the phone, his mind racing through the implications of this revelation. Crane hadn't just been taking advantage of an elderly man's crisis, he'd been attempting systematic fraud, offering a fraction of the land's actual value, while presenting himself as a benefactor providing much-needed assistance. The brass compass that had belonged to Sarah's grandfather sat on the mantel above the fireplace, its needle pointing steadily north despite the chaos that surrounded it. Her grandfather had been a surveyor, a man who understood the value of land, not just in dollars, but in the careful measurement of boundaries, elevations, and natural resources. That compass had guided him through decades of honest work, helping families understand exactly what they owned and what it was worth. Boone lifted the compass from its place of honor, feeling its weight in his palm as he considered his options. The situation had changed fundamentally. He was no longer a desperate man with no alternatives, but someone who possessed valuable assets and the knowledge to use them wisely. At 9:15, his phone rang again. This time, the caller was Dr. Patterson, Mr. McCready. "I've been thinking about Rex's situation overnight, and I wanted to discuss some additional options we might explore." The veterinarian's voice carried the careful optimism of someone who'd found reasons for hope. "I've spoken with colleagues at the veterinary college, and there's a possibility we could qualify Rex for a research program that would cover most of his treatment costs." Boone's heart leaped. "What kind of research program?" "They're studying nutritional recovery protocols in canines, specifically looking at how different treatment approaches affect long-term health outcomes." Rex would receive the same high-quality care we discussed, but as part of a study that could help other dogs facing similar crises. Dr. Patterson paused. The only cost to you would be about $500 for initial diagnostics and monitoring equipment. $500. A sum that was still significant for Boone's budget, but manageable through careful planning and perhaps the sale of some tools or equipment. More importantly, it was an amount that wouldn't require sacrificing Sarah's land or accepting Crane's fraudulent offer. Doc, that sounds like a gift from heaven. When could we start? This afternoon, if you're interested. I've already submitted Rex's medical history, and the research team is excited about including him in the study. His case fits their parameters perfectly. Boone felt tears gathering in his eyes as the weight of impossible choices began to lift from his shoulders. Rex could be saved without destroying everything Sarah had loved, without surrendering to a man who viewed other people's desperation as business opportunity. Yes, he said without hesitation. Yes, we want to be part of that program. After arranging to bring Rex to the clinic at 2 o'clock, Boone hung up the phone and sat in his kitchen, surrounded by the sudden gift of possibilities he thought were lost forever. The morning that had begun with the prospect of devastating loss had transformed into something approaching miracle. The kind of unexpected blessing that reminded him why faith mattered even when circumstances looked hopeless. Rex lifted his head from his blanket, perhaps sensing the change in Boone's mood, and managed a weak but genuine tail wag. The dog's eyes held the same trust they'd always shown, but now that trust was matched by hope, both theirs and his human companions. At 10:30, Boone made one final phone call, dialing the number for Crane's private line with a sense of satisfaction that felt almost as good as revenge. Mr. Crane. Boone McCready. Ah, Mr. McCready, I was beginning to wonder if you'd decided to let pride override practical necessity. Crane's voice carried the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was predetermined. I trust you're calling to accept my offer. Actually, I'm calling to thank you for an important lesson about the difference between fair business practices and exploitation. Boone kept his tone conversational, even friendly. You see, I had my property independently assessed this morning, and it turns out your generous offer was about half of what my land is actually worth. Silence stretched across the phone line, long enough for Boone to imagine Crane's expression shifting from confidence to something approaching concern. Mr. McCready, property values are subjective. $450,000, Boone interrupted gently. That's what qualified assessors say my 5 acres are worth in the current market. Makes your $200,000 look a bit less generous, doesn't it? Now see here, Crane began, his tone hardening as the conversation moved away from his preferred script. Market assessments can be inflated, especially when, and fortunately, Boone continued, enjoying the rare pleasure of delivering good news after days of crisis, I won't need to sell at any price. Rex's medical situation has been resolved through a research program that will provide the treatment he needs at a fraction of the cost. The silence that followed felt like winter breaking into spring, cold giving way to warmth, desperation melting into possibility. When Crane finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. You're making a mistake, McCready. My offer won't be available indefinitely, and mountain properties like yours don't find buyers easily. Maybe so, Boone agreed cheerfully, but at least now I know what it's actually worth. And more importantly, I know what kind of man I'm dealing with. He hung up the phone before Crane could respond, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The brass compass still pointed north, steady and true, just as Sarah's grandfather had taught her and she had taught him. Some directions never changed, no matter how confusing the landscape became. Rex was going to live. The mountain would remain in family hands, and Elias Crane would have to find someone else's desperation to exploit. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and patches of blue sky were beginning to show through the clouds that had covered the valley for days. It was going to be a beautiful afternoon for a drive to the veterinary clinic, where healing would begin and hope would be restored to its rightful place in their lives. By noon, the mountain air carried the crisp promise of better weather, and Rex had shown enough improvement to make the trip down to Dr. Patterson's clinic without undue stress. Boone loaded his companion carefully into the passenger seat of the old pickup truck, arranging blankets to provide comfort for the winding journey ahead. The dog's eyes held more alertness than they'd shown in days, as if he sensed that this trip might lead somewhere hopeful, rather than merely prolonging an inevitable goodbye. The silver medical bracelet that Dr. Patterson had provided gleamed against Rex's golden fur, its engraved identification marking him as a participant in the university's research program. The simple piece of metal represented more than just medical monitoring. It was a symbol of second chances, of scientific advancement serving compassion, of solutions appearing when all seemed lost. "We're going to fix this, boy," Boone said softly, one hand resting on Rex's head as they began the descent from Pine Ridge. "You're going to get the help you need, and we're going to stay right here on our mountain, where we belong." The drive through Ironwood Valley revealed a community slowly awakening from winter's grip. Smoke rose from chimneys of homes where families were gathering for lunch, and children played in yards where snow had begun to reveal patches of brown grass underneath. It was the kind of scene that spoke of continuity and belonging, of lives built through daily choices rather than grand gestures. As they passed Crane's estate, Boone noticed increased activity behind the ornate iron gates. Construction vehicles had appeared overnight, along with surveying equipment and workers in hard hats who moved with the purposeful efficiency of people beginning a significant project. Mrs. Harrison stood near the main entrance, consulting a tablet while directing traffic with the authority of someone managing a complex operation. Boone slowed the truck slightly, curious about the sudden burst of activity. Through the gaps in the fence, he could see men measuring distances and marking trees with bright orange spray paint, the universal language of development preparing to transform wilderness into profit. At Dr. Patterson's clinic, the research team from the university was already assembled and waiting. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead researcher, was a woman in her 40s whose gentle manner with animals was matched by an obvious passion for her work. Her assistant, a graduate student named Marcus, had prepared detailed documentation that would track every aspect of Rex's treatment and recovery. "Mr. McCready," Dr. Chen said as they carefully transferred Rex to an examination table, "I want you to know how grateful we are that you're allowing Rex to participate in our study. His case represents exactly the kind of nutritional crisis we're hoping to address through improved treatment protocols." Rex submitted to the initial examinations with patient dignity, occasionally looking toward Boone for reassurance, but showing no resistance to the careful handling and gentle probing. The research team worked with practiced efficiency, drawing blood samples, taking measurements, and establishing baseline data that would guide his treatment plan. "What we're looking at," Dr. Chen explained as she reviewed Rex's vital signs, "is a comprehensive approach that combines traditional veterinary medicine with cutting-edge nutritional science. We're particularly interested in how different recovery protocols affect long-term health outcomes and quality of life." Boone nodded, grateful for the detailed explanation, but more focused on the steady improvement he could already see in Rex's demeanor. The clinical environment seemed to energize his companion, perhaps because it represented active intervention rather than passive waiting for the inevitable. "The treatment will take approximately 10 days, Dr. Patterson added, checking the IV line that would deliver the first round of specialized nutrients. "Rex will stay here where we can monitor his progress continuously. But you're welcome to visit whenever you'd like." "I'd appreciate that," Boone replied, already missing the weight of Rex's presence beside him. "He's been my only company for 2 years now. The cabin's gonna feel pretty empty without him." Dr. Chen's expression softened with understanding. The bond between humans and their animal companions is one of the most powerful healing forces we see in our work. Rex's recovery will be aided significantly by knowing you're nearby and invested in his treatment. As the medical team prepared Rex for his first treatment session, Boone found himself thinking about the morning's revelations and their implications for the broader community. Crane's development activities had clearly accelerated, suggesting that the businessman was moving forward with expansion plans despite losing access to the Pine Ridge property. Other families in the valley might soon face the same pressure that Boone had experienced. The same manipulation disguised as generous assistance. "Dr. Patterson," Boone said as they completed the initial paperwork, "I need to ask you something. Have other folks in the valley mentioned being approached by Elias Crane about selling their land?" The veterinarian's expression grew thoughtful. "Actually, yes. The Henderson family came in last week with their elderly collie, and Bill mentioned that Crane had made an offer on their place. They seemed torn about whether to accept. The money would help with medical bills, but that land has been in their family for generations." "What did you tell them?" "I suggested they get an independent appraisal before making any decisions. Property values in this area have been rising faster than most people realize, especially with the development pressure from the resort industry." Boone felt a familiar stirring of concern, the same protective instinct that had driven him to help neighbors with everything from fallen trees to medical emergencies throughout his years on the mountain. The Henderson family deserved to know what their land was actually worth, just as other valley residents deserved protection from predatory offers disguised as community assistance. "Doc, would you mind if I stopped by their place on my way home? Bill Henderson and I go back a long way. We used to work together during timber season." "I think that's a fine idea," Dr. Patterson replied with evident approval. "Sometimes the best protection against exploitation is simply making sure people have accurate information." As Boone prepared to leave Rex in the capable hands of the research team, his companion lifted his head one final time, brown eyes seeking reassurance about this temporary separation. Boone knelt beside the examination table, running his fingers through the golden fur that already seemed to have more life in it than it had shown in days. "I'll be back tomorrow, boy," he promised. "You focus on getting strong, and I'll take care of things at home." Rex's tail managed a weak but genuine wag, and his tongue flicked out to touch Boone's hand in a gesture that spoke of trust and affection that transcended words. The bond between them had been forged through years of shared experience, tested by loss and hardship, and now strengthened by the knowledge that love could indeed find a way when the alternative seemed impossible. The drive to the Henderson place took Boone through the heart of Ironwood Valley, past farms and homes that represented the agricultural heritage that had sustained the community for generations. Each property told a story of families who had chosen to build their lives in harmony with the mountain environment, accepting the challenges of rural living in exchange for the rewards of independence and natural beauty. The Henderson farm occupied a gentle slope on the valley's eastern edge, where Bill and Margaret had raised 3 children and countless generations of livestock over 4 decades of marriage. Their modest farmhouse showed the careful maintenance of people who understood that preservation required constant attention, and their pastures still held the remnants of hay bales that had fed cattle through the worst of winter. Bill Henderson was in his barn when Boone arrived, tending to a mare that was heavy with foal. He was a man in his 70s, whose weathered hands and stooped shoulders spoke of a lifetime spent in honest labor, but whose eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most respected farmers in the valley. "Boone McCready," Bill said with genuine pleasure, setting down his grooming brush to shake hands. "Haven't seen you since Margaret's funeral. How are you holding up on that mountain?" "Better than I was this morning," Boone replied honestly. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something Dr. Patterson mentioned. He said Elias Crane made you an offer on your place." Bill's expression grew cautious. "He did. Generous offer, too. More money than Margaret and I ever thought we'd see. But I'll be honest with you, Boone, the whole thing felt wrong somehow. Like he was in too much of a hurry, too eager to close the deal." "What did he offer?" $150,000 for our 40 acres. Said it was fair market value, maybe even a little generous, considering the condition of some of our buildings. Boone felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the same pattern that had been used against him. Bill, I think you should know that I had my property assessed yesterday. 5 acres on Pine Ridge came back valued at $450,000. The number hung in the air between them, like thunder rolling across the valley. Bill's eyes widened as he calculated what that assessment might mean for his own property. You're saying my 40 acres might be worth considerably more than what Crane offered, Boone confirmed. I'd suggest getting your own appraisal before you make any decisions. And Bill, I'd suggest doing it quickly. Crane's got construction crews working on his place today, which means he's moving forward with expansion plans, whether he gets our properties or not. The silver medical bracelet on Rex's leg had represented hope and healing. Now, as Boone prepared to help his neighbors understand the true value of what they owned, he felt the weight of another kind of responsibility, the obligation to protect his community from those who would exploit their trust and threaten their way of life. By evening, word had spread through Ironwood Valley with the speed that only small communities can achieve when urgent news needs sharing. The Henderson family had contacted their neighbors, who had called their friends, who had reached out to relatives, until nearly every property owner in the valley understood that they might have been targeted for exploitation disguised as generous assistance. The old Grange Hall hadn't seen this many people since the Harvest Festival 3 years ago. Families filled the wooden folding chairs that had served community gatherings for decades, while others stood along the walls or sat on the floor with children in their laps. The building hummed with the kind of energy that emerges when ordinary people realize they possess collective power they hadn't known they wielded. Margaret Kowalski from the county assessor's office had driven down from the courthouse to provide official guidance, bringing boxes of forms and assessment documents that could help families understand their rights. Dr. Patterson had closed his clinic early to attend, knowing that community health extended beyond individual animals to encompass the economic well-being of the people who cared for them. At the front of the hall, Bill Henderson stood with a folder full of documentation that had arrived by fax throughout the afternoon. Independent appraisers, alerted by Janet Kowalski's morning phone calls, had provided preliminary assessments for dozens of valley properties based on publicly available information and recent comparable sales. "Folks," Bill began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of honest dealing, "I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. We've got some important information to share and some decisions to make about how we protect our community." He opened the folder and pulled out the first document, holding it high enough for everyone to see. "This is the preliminary assessment for our farm, 40 acres that Elias Crane offered us $150,000 for yesterday. According to 3 independent appraisers, it's actually worth somewhere between $600,000 and $750,000. Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd as the magnitude of the attempted deception became clear. These weren't marginal differences in valuation. They represented systematic fraud designed to transfer valuable assets at a fraction of their worth. "The Peterson place," Bill continued, consulting another document where Henrik's widow is struggling with medical bills. "Crane offered her $80,000 for 20 acres. Actual assessed value is between $400,000 and $500,000. More voices joined the growing chorus of outrage, but underneath the anger ran something deeper and more powerful, the recognition that they weren't alone in facing these pressures, and that collective action might provide protection that individual resistance couldn't achieve. The town hall meeting minutes, recorded in a leather-bound ledger that had documented community decisions since the 1940s, would capture this moment as a turning point in Ironwood Valley's history. The artifact that represented democratic action and collective wisdom. Its pages filled with records of barn raisings, school board elections, and disaster response efforts that had sustained the community through decades of challenges. What we're looking at, Margaret Kowalski explained as she addressed the crowd, is a coordinated effort to acquire valuable properties through deliberate misrepresentation of their worth. In legal terms, this constitutes fraud, and there are both civil and criminal remedies available to protect yourselves. She opened her briefcase and pulled out copies of forms that could initiate official investigations into Crane's business practices. The State Attorney General's office has a division that specifically handles real estate fraud cases, with documentation of systematic deception across multiple properties. We could build a case that might result in significant penalties and restitution. Boone stood near the back of the hall, watching neighbors who had lived independently for decades come together in shared purpose. These were people who had chosen mountain life precisely because it allowed them to be self-sufficient, to solve their own problems without relying on outside assistance. But tonight, they were learning that some challenges required collective action to overcome. "What about the construction work that's already started?" asked Jim Caldwell, whose property bordered Crane's estate. "There's been heavy equipment moving around behind those gates all day, and it looks like they're clearing trees for a major building project." Margaret consulted her notes before responding. "Any development of that scale requires environmental impact studies and building permits that have to be filed with the county. If Crane is proceeding without proper authorization, that gives us additional legal grounds to halt construction until all regulations are properly followed." The evening progressed with the methodical efficiency of people who understood that emotion alone wouldn't solve their problems, but that careful planning and coordinated action might succeed where individual resistance had failed. Committees were formed to research legal options, contact state authorities, and organize community resistance to predatory development practices. As the meeting concluded near 10 o'clock, Boone felt a satisfaction that went beyond personal victory. Rex was recovering under expert medical care. His own property would remain in family hands, and the broader community was mobilizing to protect itself from exploitation that threatened the character and integrity of the valley they all loved. The old Grange Hall had witnessed many important moments in Ironwood Valley's history, but tonight's gathering might prove to be among the most significant. The moment when ordinary people discovered that their collective strength could overcome forces that seemed insurmountable when faced alone. The confrontation came at dawn 3 days later, when Elias Crane's black sedan pulled up Boone's driveway with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and superior resources. Behind him followed a convoy of vehicles, lawyers, security personnel, and what appeared to be county officials whose presence suggested that Crane had connections, extending far beyond his immediate business interests. Boone was waiting on his porch, dressed in his best flannel shirt and holding the golden deed that had transferred Sarah's family land to him upon their marriage. The document, signed and witnessed 43 years ago, represented not just legal ownership, but generational commitment to the mountain that had sheltered and sustained the people he loved most. "Mr. McCready," Crane called out as he emerged from his sedan, his expensive overcoat immaculate despite the rough mountain road. "I think it's time we settled this matter like reasonable men." "I thought we'd already settled it," Boone replied calmly, remaining seated in the rocking chair that had been his morning meditation spot for decades. "You made an offer, I declined it, and that seemed to conclude our business." Crane's smile held no warmth as he gestured toward the official-looking men who had accompanied him up the mountain. "Unfortunately, things have become more complicated since our last conversation. It seems there are some irregularities with your property taxes and land use permits that require immediate attention." One of the county officials stepped forward, consulting a clipboard thick with legal documents. "Mr. McCready, I'm Roger Blackwood from the County Planning Department. We've received reports of unpermitted structures and potential environmental violations on your property that require immediate investigation." Boone's grip tightened on the deed, though his expression remained calm. This was the kind of pressure that had driven other mountain families from their homes. the sudden discovery of bureaucratic violations that required expensive remediation or resulted in forced sales to cover penalties and legal fees. What kind of violations? Boone asked, though he suspected the specifics mattered less than the pressure they were designed to create. Blackwood consulted his papers with theatrical precision. Unpermitted additions to your cabin, possible septic system violations, and questions about water rights that may not comply with current environmental regulations. The fines for these violations could easily exceed $50,000, plus the cost of bringing everything into compliance. The threat was clear and expertly crafted. Even if Boone could prove his innocence of these suddenly discovered violations, the legal costs and bureaucratic delays would create exactly the kind of financial pressure that made Crane's offers seem like salvation rather than exploitation. But Boone had learned something important during the community meeting. 3 nights ago, he wasn't facing these pressures alone. "Anymore, Mr. Blackwood," Boone said, rising slowly from his chair with the dignity that came from decades of honest living. "I think you should know that every property owner in Ironwood Valley received similar visits yesterday, all citing remarkably similar violations that somehow escaped official notice until this week." Blackwood's expression flickered with uncertainty, perhaps recognizing that coordinated enforcement actions of this type invited scrutiny from state authorities who took a dim view of local officials abusing their power for private gain. Furthermore, Boone continued, pulling a folded document from his shirt pocket, "I think you should also know that the State Attorney General's office has opened a formal investigation into fraudulent real estate practices in this county, specifically targeting coordinated efforts to manipulate property values and exploit elderly landowners." Crane's confident demeanor began to show cracks as he realized that his usual tactics were encountering unexpected resistance. The mountain man he'd expected to intimidate into submission had somehow acquired legal protection and community support that changed the entire dynamic of their confrontation. "Mr. McCready," Crane said, his voice losing its earlier warmth, "you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. My development plans will proceed with or without your cooperation, and property values in this area are going to change dramatically, whether you benefit from those changes or not." "Maybe so," Boone agreed, settling back into his rocking chair with the golden deed still secure in his weathered hands. "But at least now everyone knows what their land is actually worth, and what kind of man they're dealing with." The sound of vehicles coming up the mountain road interrupted their standoff, and Boone smiled as he recognized the convoy of pickup trucks and SUVs carrying his neighbors to this predetermined confrontation. Bill Henderson led the procession, followed by the Caldwell family, the Yamamoto descendants, Henrik Peterson's widow, and nearly every other property owner in the valley. They parked in a semicircle around Crane's vehicles, their occupants emerging with the quiet determination of people who had decided that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. Each family carried their own deed, their own documentation of legal ownership that stretched back generations in some cases. Margaret Kowalski's county vehicle brought up the rear, followed by a sedan carrying investigators from the state Attorney General's office, who had arrived earlier than expected to document what promised to be a confrontation that would determine the future character of Ironwood Valley. The golden deed in Boone's hands caught the morning light as he stood to greet his neighbors, its significance extending far beyond the legal transfer of property to encompass the preservation of a way of life that had sustained mountain communities for generations. 6 months later, Rex bounded through the pine forest with the exuberant energy of a dog who had forgotten he'd ever been sick. His golden coat gleamed in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy, and his enthusiastic barking echoed across the mountain ridges as he chased shadows and investigated the fascinating scents that marked the transition from winter to full summer. The research program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only had Rex made a complete recovery, but the treatment protocols developed during his case had been refined and shared with veterinary programs across the country. Dr. Chen had published papers that credited Rex's participation with advancing understanding of nutritional recovery in canines, ensuring that other dogs facing similar crises would benefit from the knowledge gained through his treatment. Boone sat on his porch, watching his companion explore the familiar territory with renewed vigor, and marveled at how completely their lives had been transformed by a series of events that had once seemed devastating. The hand-carved wooden cross above the door caught the morning light, its roses as carefully detailed as the day Sarah had requested them, a reminder that love endured through seasons of loss and seasons of unexpected blessing. The bronze plaque mounted beside his front door told a story that visitors found both inspiring and educational. Ironwood Valley Community Preservation Project, it read, established 2024 in recognition of collective action to protect rural heritage and prevent predatory development practices. The plaque had been a gift from the State Attorney General's office, acknowledging the community's role in exposing a fraud scheme that had been operating throughout the mountain counties. Elias Crane's legal troubles had multiplied like avalanches, gathering momentum down a steep slope. The systematic fraud investigation had revealed patterns of exploitation spanning multiple counties and affecting hundreds of elderly property owners. Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and regulatory penalties had combined to dismantle his development empire and provide restitution to families who had been deceived into selling valuable land for fractions of its worth. The mansion that had once dominated the valley floor now stood empty, its manicured gardens slowly returning to the wild state that mountain land preferred when left to its own devices. The county had seized the property to satisfy judgment debts, and there was talk of converting it into a community center that would serve the valley's residents, rather than symbolizing their displacement. Dr. Patterson's clinic had expanded to include a satellite office of the university's veterinary research program, bringing cutting-edge medical care to rural communities that had previously struggled to access specialized treatment. The success of Rex's case had demonstrated the value of combining academic research with practical community needs, creating partnerships that benefited both scientific advancement and animal welfare. The telephone rang, interrupting Boone's peaceful morning meditation, but the sound no longer carried the threat of crisis that had once made him approach every call with trepidation. These days, most calls brought news of community activities, updates from neighbors, or invitations to participate in the various committees and organizations that had emerged from their collective resistance to exploitation. Mr. McCready, this is David Chen from the University Press. The young man's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone working on a story that mattered to him personally. I'm calling about the book we discussed, the one documenting how your community organized to protect itself from predatory development. We'd like to schedule a final interview with you and Rex for the conclusion. The book project had been Dr. Sarah Chen's idea, a way to document the lessons learned during the fraud investigation and provide guidance for other rural communities facing similar pressures. Publishers had shown immediate interest in a story that combined human drama with practical advice about protecting property rights and organizing effective community resistance. Rex and I would be happy to help, Boone replied, watching his companion emerge from the forest with a stick that was almost as large as he was. Though I'm not sure Rex has much to add to the legal analysis, David Chen laughed. Actually, Rex's story is central to the whole narrative. The research program that saved his life became a model for university community partnerships that serve both academic and practical purposes. And the way his crisis led to uncovering the fraud scheme shows how personal struggles can sometimes reveal broader systemic problems. After scheduling the interview for the following week, Boone hung up the phone and returned to his contemplation of the morning's beauty. The mountain had taught him many lessons over the years, but perhaps the most important was that apparent endings often became new beginnings, and that love could indeed find a way when courage and community combined to create possibilities that seemed impossible when faced alone. Rex dropped his enormous stick at Boone's feet and looked up with the expression of a dog who considered this offering to be a treasure beyond price. His brown eyes held the same trust and affection they'd always shown, but now those emotions were grounded in the security of perfect health and the knowledge that the humans in his world possessed both the wisdom and resources to protect what mattered most. The bronze plaque caught the afternoon light as Boone rose to throw Rex's stick down the mountain slope, where it would provide another opportunity for exuberant retrieval. The plaque represented more than community achievement. It symbolized the truth that individual struggles, when shared with others who cared enough to act, could become the foundation for positive change that extended far beyond personal victory. Sarah's roses on the wooden cross nodded in the mountain breeze, beautiful and enduring. A reminder that love expressed through daily choices and principled action could indeed survive the harshest winters and bloom again when conditions were right. Rex barked with joy as he chased his stick through the pine forest, and Boone smiled as he watched his faithful companion embrace the gift of a life saved through the grace of unexpected allies and the power of communities that refused to surrender to exploitation. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was, indeed, to let go of what couldn't be preserved. But sometimes, with enough courage and the right kind of help, you discovered that love could find a way to preserve everything that truly mattered.